earlier talk. But I think, as with a lot of things, wisdom is often illustrated by referring to various types of stories and examples. For example, in the Berlin wisdom paradigm, respondents are given scenarios and then they're asked to think about how they would solve them, how they would approach them. So they might be given the instructions like the following: please read the following examples and then think aloud about what you would do if you were faced with this problem. So the respondents, as you can see, they sort of think through and reason through these problems, and then trained judges score their responses according to a number of different criteria. So in our proposed work, we're operationalizing wisdom as intuitive problem solving, and I think this affords a number of benefits. We're looking directly at the implicit, non-conscious aspects of wise decision-making, and in other words, we're focusing on intuition. And the basic question here is, what kinds of psychological processes might underlie the performance on these types of insight problems? Cognitive accessibility and implicit positivity, and I'll say a couple of words about each of these. Accessibility is just the degree to which a knowledge item, concept, action is currently active in one's memory. Implicit positivity is the degree to which a knowledge item, concept, or action is spontaneously and unintentionally desired, or in other words, evaluated in a positive manner. That the more a stimulus that might represent an activity, an event, an object can be used to fulfill a current goal that the person holds, the more the person is going to spontaneously and unintentionally evaluate that stimulus in a positive way. So our central hypothesis here is twofold. First, we expect that solutions to these types of insight problems should become increasingly accessible in memory before reaching the person's consciousness. And there's also, as I mentioned, a little bit of support for this. But secondly, that solutions should also become increasingly implicitly positive before they reach the person's consciousness. In terms of our empirical strategy, we're going to first measure the accessibility and implicit positivity of the solutions to these types of CRAT items, and then examine whether these two factors predict performance, insight performance. We're also going to manipulate these two factors to see whether high levels of these two factors might causally increase insight performance. And then we're also going to try to extend any findings from the initial experiments to look at the phenomenon of incubation, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and non-conscious problem solving a little more generally. So we're proposing at least four experiments to start off. In the first experiment, we're going to measure these two mechanisms and then see whether they predict performance. The second one will focus on manipulating them, as I mentioned. And then the third and fourth experiments will look at whether these two mechanisms explain, at least in part, incubation. And I'll say, just in terms of the contributions of the research, we'll start to get at identifying some of the mechanisms that underlie intuition, which is this, in some ways, very mysterious, introspectively unreportable phenomenon. We'll begin an analysis of wise decision-making at the level of cognitive processes. And then if some of the findings that we predicted emerge, then it could have implications for how these two mechanisms operate in non-conscious thought a little more generally.